My name's Nia. My pronouns are they, them, and I worked at Comma for 2 years. I've just left. Comma is a independent press based in Manchester. They focus on the short story and literature and translation. They publish a lot of anthologies that are political in nature, covering a huge array of things. Like they had a book with scientists from CERN and books covering. They have a city series which I highly recommend, where they take writers from each city and let them kind of introduce that city in short story form for you. So yeah, I'm here kind of representing them, but also just as a fan of queer literature, and as somebody who would like to know more about what you get up to.
Hi, I'm Andrew. I've been in publishing for 13 years. Um, and I started out in academic publishing and then I moved into, I don't know what I'd call it. It was like professional, trade, children's, academic. It kind of covered the whole remit at a publisher called Jessica Kingsley. Whilst I was there, I launched a list. We called it the Gender Diversity List, but basically it was publishing for trans people, written by trans people, and it was for children all the way up to kind of older people. And we spanned a whole range of formats. And that list kind of expanded, and we did a lot of publishing around sexuality as well. So it kind of became a sort of queer list, as it were. And then I left there in 2022, had a bit of a break from publishing. And then when I came back, I still wanted to be in the kind of industry, and queer representation was really important to me. So I felt like starting an agency was quite a good idea. Agents are the kind of beginning of the publishing process, as it were. A lot of editors only work with agents, so I felt that if I could represent queer writers and kind of pitch them to editors, I could help with representation in the industry. And the remit of Frog is that we only represent queer writers. The writing that writers do doesn't have to be queer, and we do fiction and non-fiction, but we don't represent anyone who isn't queer. And we just hope that by doing that, we'll be able to improve and increase representation in the industry.
So when did you start Frog? That was
So we launched May this year or April this year. So we're really new.
okay.
Yeah, I came up with the idea sort of like in January, February, and then launched in May, April. Yes. Yeah, so.
And have the like, what do you think that you offer queer writers that they maybe weren't getting before, or having not been represented by a specifically queer agency? What does that offer then, do you think? What do you feel?
I think one is I'm quite attuned, I suppose, to the kind of queer world. And I don't know how to describe it in terms of literature, like especially for my last job, we published really specific books that a lot of other publishers probably wouldn't have taken on. And I think because of that, I have quite an intimate knowledge of like queer lives and kind of like what people want to read. Some of those books we published, though they were niche, became like bestsellers in the sense of kind of the publishing that we did. And it just made me, so for example, I did a graphic novel on asexuality. I think when we signed it, we were like, is this going to sell? You know, how many ace people are there? And it became like such a strong selling book for us. You know, it was like selling in the thousands, which is, you know, was quite big for that company. And it just made me see that there is something there. And I felt like because of that, I'm kind of attuned and aware of these sorts of kind of themes and stories that maybe bigger publishers will maybe miss because they're not so in that kind of community, as it were, and haven't been reading around the kind of topic as much. So I think that's quite important. And then another part of it is just a kind of community, and all the people that I represent have become kind of aware of each other. They kind of support each other, and I think that's really important. They're not just kind of individuals. They're kind of like, it's almost like a little family, as it were, and they can all be on that same sort of journey, which I think is quite nice. And there's no kind of prescriptiveness to the agency. We're really open to anything and kind of giving anything a go as long as I sort of think it has some kind of success. And I think that openness is really important. I think a lot of agencies maybe will focus more on the kind of profile of an author, for example. And though that's really important, I do think it's the idea as well that's really essential. And sometimes an author might not have a platform, but the idea is brilliant, and it's about trying to kind of make that work.
How closely then do you work with the author when approaching editors? Would you kind of like have specific editors in mind or publishing houses, or would you take on the author's kind of preference with that?
It really varies. So, because I used to work as an editor, I'm very editorially focused as an
Mm.
agent. So, I do tend to spend a lot of time up front before we pitch, kind of working with the author. Like some ideas have come in and they've completely transformed into something else, just because I felt like I could make that idea work rather than the idea that was initially pitched. So, that I
Mm.
can see like a sort of nugget of brilliance there, but it's not quite right yet. So, sometimes it's really about refining that idea. So I always ask authors if there's specific people they want to publish with. You know, a lot of people are like Penguin, but you know, obviously they want the big publishers. But there are obviously, I mean, I am finding a lot more success with independent publishers. I think that they're more open to kind of these sorts of stories. For example, I took one client on. Their first book was actually published by Penguin, an imprint there. Brilliant. That's such a brilliant writer. The book's set in Liverpool. It's not my kind of book at all. I would not read this in my like personal life, but I just was immediately gripped by it.
Mm.
And it was like a lesbian romance, but it had a bit of a kind of grittier edge to it. And I was like, oh, this will be snapped up. Like she's a brilliant writer. She's been published by Penguin, and it was actually quite hard to sell it. I was quite surprised. And then I took it to a northern publisher because I said to the author, like, maybe we should see whether some northern publishing houses will take it because of its like setting, and it was taken straight away.
Yeah.
And I just sort of felt like maybe they saw what the other publishers didn't see, partly because of the setting. You know, there is still a huge divide between London and like the rest of the UK. So I think that's kind of important. And then that kind of queer element to it and the grittiness to it. It was because it was a romance. Some of the romance publishers were like, our audience won't be able to like basically deal with the fact that there's a kind of prostitute in the storyline. And it was like, okay. So it's kind of, you know, queer lives aren't kind of sanitary and safe sometimes. There was a kind of, they're on the edges. And sometimes that doesn't quite fit into the genre that editors want. So you might need to find independent presses who are a bit more like radical maybe, or have a bit more of an open mind when it comes to the kind of stories they want to take on.
How important do you feel like independent presses are with getting authors their first step or even second step, like you're saying, like, you know?
Yeah, I think that it's vital, I would
Yeah.
say. Firstly, because a lot of independents actually have open submissions, so
Okay.
they take unsolicited, so you don't need an agent, which is really important. You know, getting an agent in itself is quite a difficult task sometimes. You know, there's a lot of competition. But I think, yeah, we were talking earlier about how independents it's called taking a risk, which I don't really like that phrase because I don't think queer books are a risk for a publisher to take on. But I think I think that's often how it's phrased because they're seen as books that bigger publishers maybe don't think there's a market for, but independent publishers are willing to kind of take them on because they maybe see that there is a market or they see that kind of brilliance there. And then they sort of lead the way, I think, when it comes to publishing and kind of ideas and queer lives, because these are really exciting new stories, whereas some of the bigger publishers maybe kind of follow trends. They love comparable titles. Everyone wants the same sort of book, whereas I think independents are kind of thinking much further ahead. They're kind of riding the crest of the wave, as it were, and some publishers are just kind of following. That's how I feel sometimes.
And you mentioned earlier as well that in these larger presses that it's quite commonly the junior editors who are more willing, say, to take these writers on or pitch them higher up. Does that give you some hope for the future of publishing, or do
Yeah,
you think
yeah.
you know?
I'm not ageist, but I think like, you know, I shouldn't say that. But I think, yeah, the younger people, you know, I just think younger people are more engaged with what's kind of happening in the world and with like diversity and representation. I mean, when I started in my last role, that was like 6 or 7 years ago, even then, like trans lives or the trans tipping point had only just happened. And, it did feel like trans people weren't as visible, and now they really are. And I think a lot of that is to do with younger people coming out earlier or younger people kind of voicing it online. I think they just have a kind of better mindset when it comes to this sort of publishing, and I just feel they are more receptive to kind of what's kind of happening out there, and they can kind of see that, right? Like an editor, I mean, publishing is really subjective, right? You're going to take something on because you like it, and that even though there's a business kind of decision there in the background, your likes and dislikes will be informed by your life, right? And
Yeah.
so I guess if you're from a younger generation who's more engaged with kind of what's happening and like activism and rights, etc., then I think you'll just kind of inherently be drawn towards stories that kind of have that sort of nature to them. Whereas if you're older, maybe, I don't know, that's not everyone, obviously, but I just think that can kind of happen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And what role does the agency take once the author has been signed? So yeah, if you could talk us through those steps.
Yeah. So basically, when I take someone on, we'll work together on that pitch. Well, I'm working on the pitch, and then but they might need to edit the manuscript. So if it's fiction, normally you need to have a draft manuscript complete before you can kind of pitch to a publisher. Whereas non-fiction, it doesn't matter so much. You just need a proposal and like sample chapters. So there'll be different amounts of work going on. I sort of build up a pitch, send it off to publishers, and then hopefully there'll be offers. And once I kind of guide the author through that whole sort of process. So once an offer comes through, I kind of take it to the author and we talk about it, ask them, is this the right publisher for you? It's not all about the money, though that's obviously important. You want to make sure the publisher is kind of understands your vision for the book and kind of what you want to achieve with it. And then I deal with all the kind of contractual side of things and kind of negotiate the best deal for the author. After that, the editor definitely takes more responsibility for the manuscript, but then I'm there to kind of help the author, for example, with like the cover design. Maybe a cover comes through and I'm like, this is awful, we should not accept this, but the author might be like, oh, I love it, because that's just, they might be a bit nervous around the editor, or to kind of it's more like fighting their corner. Sometimes books come out and there's lots of excitement, but then it kind of dies down and maybe the sales haven't been great and the book just kind of gets sort of pushed aside, as it were. But we don't want that to happen. So it's about kind of making sure that they fulfill their promises with like the promotions and the marketing. Outside of that, there might be other deals that we want to make. So maybe we've sold UK rights and then we'd want to sell US and then like foreign. There's different formats. There's lots of deals potentially always happening. And you're also always thinking about their brand as an author, where they could be going next. They've done this one book, but have they got another book in them? Is there a series? Could the book become like a graphic novel? Could it be something else? Like we're trying to think about that as well. So it's not just kind of that one sort of deal, as it were. So it's kind of, I suppose you're just like their cheerleader and then like, just supporting them throughout that whole sort of process and kind of making them think more commercially, as it were, and about where they want to kind of take their writing.
How do you balance that relationship between, as you say, being in a community with the authors and also kind of commercially speaking, wanting the books to do as well as they can, and then those two things occasionally might butt heads? Or
Yeah, I think you have to be quite frank with authors about things. Obviously, they might have a vision for something or think this is really great, but actually, maybe it's not quite great. And you have to be kind of careful with that. But I mean, that's what the agent is there for, really, to be really honest. You're kind of like a friend as well, and like kind of sitting down and having quite a meaningful chat, but you have to be quite like, this isn't right for you. And I think there are instances where authors and agents do butt heads. An author might have a project they really want to publish, and the agent's like, no, I don't think I can sell this. Then I don't know. I guess the relationship kind of breaks down a bit then, and then you might have to go find another agent. And it's very hard to sell something if you just don't quite see that vision for the book, and that can happen. But hopefully you can kind of guide the author towards what you think is the right way for them to go. Not that you're controlling them, but you're kind of thinking about what's worked for them and kind of what publishers want. Publishing is quite fickle at the end of the day, and it does follow trends, and you kind of want to make sure the author is kind of doing the right thing for them and isn't going to end up sort of wasting their time, as it were. But if it's, again, it's all about subjectivity. I might be wrong, right? And if the author is really passionate, then they should definitely go after it. And I'd never kind of hold someone. And usually agency agreements are quite flexible. You would be able to, they're kind of like on a rolling basis. So you could just sort of like end it quite quickly. It's not like a publishing agreement, which is definitely more binding, and you have to kind of fulfill that sort of deal.
for authors that are new to kind of the publishing industry, is there any like advice that you give to them when they join you, or even before they join you? Do you explain like challenges they might face, or like just to be prepared for certain aspects?
Yes, I always ask them like what success looks like for them,
Okay,
which I
yeah.
think really varies. Again, some people are like, I just want money, which is fine, but you're
Yeah.
probably not going to get it actually. But I think that's like obviously for some it's really important. Others, it's literally just like they just want to get a book published or they want it to help them grow their career in some other way. So I think that's really important that they know what they want, and then it kind of helps me as well, especially when you're making deals because you might get a few through. They don't have like particularly good advances, but it doesn't matter too much because the publisher is going to really help support them. Um, I also ask authors to try and like it's almost like it's useful that an author can sell their book within like 10 seconds. It's almost like a Dragon's Den sort of situation. I think if you're struggling to kind of crystallize the idea of your book in that kind of 10 seconds, then it maybe isn't quite there yet, because I have to kind of pitch it to editors who get like hundreds of submissions, and we both need to be really clear what this book is doing. So I think that's quite important. It's sometimes actually quite useful to try and write your own blurb for a book as though you were kind of publishing it yourself, and then I think you can map out the kind of strengths of what that book is doing and who it's for. Thinking about the market is really important. Like, you can't just expect everyone to read your book. You need to kind of be really clear as to who you're kind of writing for. And editors will love you if you do that because they'll be like, okay, I know who this is for. I know what genre it is. I think that's quite important. And so this is kind of moving more into kind of when you're pitching to an agent as well. But I think something people do is they're like, well, my book is like X mixed with X in terms of comparing it to two other books, which can be useful, but editors obviously haven't read every book in the world, so they might not know what these books are. I think it's better if you're like, this book is like this because of this, so like because of the writing or because of the tone or because of like the characters in it. And I think if you can kind of distill your book a bit more clearly, that's really useful for editors and for agents actually. But in terms of things to be prepared for, I guess it can take a long time to get a deal. Sometimes deals happen overnight. Sometimes they can take like a year. It can be a long process to find the right publisher. And please don't feel disheartened by rejection. There's a lot of rejection in this industry, and again, it does really just come down to how subjective it is. You can pitch to like 30 agents, and it gets turned down by 29 of them. And then one person's like, I love this. It's the most perfect book. Like, it just is how it happens. So don't feel too disheartened if you kind of get rejections. I think that's just part of what happens.
And I wanted to ask this just because obviously we're in Manchester today. How do you feel, like, obviously publishing is by nature quite London centric. It's changing slightly. Do you feel like that has any knock on effect on the types of writers that you're representing or the stories that are coming out? Obviously, you mentioned the Liverpool book earlier.
Yeah, I think do have quite a few northern writers actually on the books, and it's actually not really. I suppose I'm not really. I don't know. I don't think about diversity so
Yeah.
much when I sign, which is kind of sounds kind of weird and strange. But I think because it's kind of quite natural to me, I just sort of take people on, and then I'm like, oh yeah, they are actually really diverse. I didn't even kind of twig that. And like, whereas I think maybe for some other editors, especially in London, there's almost like a quota, and they kind of want to fulfil something in some way. Whereas Fog isn't really like that. I think we just take people on, and it just happens to be that it's just like diverse, which
Yeah.
is great. Like, but I guess in terms of I don't. I don't know, like in terms of the stories, because there are publishers and imprints coming up. I suppose it's more that there's the limitation, right? Like if you've got a story set in the north and you pitch it to say some northern publishing houses and they will turn it down, then it's a bit like, okay, now I'm not too sure where to take this. I can take it obviously to all these other imprints, but will it be as successful? I suppose it's just a kind of smaller net, as it were. That can be a slight struggle. Like I had a writer from Scotland, and I was pitching it to Scottish publishers, but again, there's not a huge amount. And then I did worry, like, oh, if a Scottish publisher doesn't want to take it on, will I struggle then afterwards? Which isn't always the case, but I guess once that diversity becomes more and more kind of like narrowed down or more intersectional in a horrible way, it feels like you're kind of limited in some sense, which isn't what it should be like. It should just be the same for everyone, but I don't know if that's quite how it is at the moment, I would say.
And where do you see Frog going? Are you looking to grow the number of authors? Obviously, it's just, you were telling me it's just you at the moment.
Yes, it's
So
just me at the moment.
yeah.
I don't, yeah, right. And until I get a really big deal through, it might just be me, but we'll see. And then, yeah, I don't know at the moment. I don't know. I've got lots of books coming up.
Yeah.
I've got authors who have got much bigger profiles than what I've just who I've signed recently.
Yeah.
So things could change. I'm not too sure. So it's definitely gradually evolving. And I'm definitely learning a lot about the industry from the other side and kind of what people are looking for and like how decisions are made about books, which is quite fascinating. And maybe why there are kind of these restrictions for kind of queer writers. It's becoming a little bit more, because where I used to work, I was like in total control, as it were. Like sometimes I'd have an idea and I'd pitch it and I'd just sign it, or something would come to me and I'd take it on. So I wasn't really thinking too much about kind of those restrictions. Whereas now, because I've got, though I take something on, doesn't mean it's going to get published. I have to kind of get it through another kind of door, as it were. And, you know, that's kind of harder. So I'm seeing that kind of harder side to publishing.
And are the writers and the books that you take on, are they a spread across fiction, non-fiction, YA, children?
Yeah, we have everything. We've got literary, romance. I've got, yeah, the Scottish book is like written in Shetland dialect, you know, that's really, it's very different. I've got illustrated books. I don't do children's or poetry at the moment. I've got a sci-fi book. So I was really open.
Yeah.
I think I might start moving more towards non-fiction just because I'm having more success and it's more my kind of area. But yeah, and I'm close to fiction at the moment, but yeah, we are quite broad in what we sort of represent.
And are there any kind of success stories about individual writers you'd like to share, or just anything that you've noticed about their like journey with you so far, or obviously that's still quite new, but any growth or change that you've seen that
what well, I'm trying to think of who I've signed. Well, I had one. It was a previous author, and we published a book together. About it was like about gay relationships, being a kind of gay man today. And then they had a second book, which is like I can't really say who it's being published by, but it's like a collection of letters written to like the younger queer self, and it's going to have lots of kind of famous queer people involved. And they tried to get it published, but they really struggled. And then I was like, met up with them when I started the agency, and I was like, oh, I think this is a really great book, but I think they'd kind of lost heart with it, and because they weren't getting much interest. And then we sort of reshaped the proposal. We thought about who we could bring on board, who would be really appealing to publishers, and then we pitched it, and then it got snapped up by like a really big publisher. I can't announce it, unfortunately, but like that was like that just made their day, because where I used to work, we didn't really offer advances, and the deal was kind of more of like an academic publishing sense. Whereas with this one, you know, they're getting the kind of full treatment. So it's really nice to see someone go from a kind of smaller press to something much bigger, but they've managed to retain their kind of their like integrity, I suppose, of their work, and they're doing what they want and what they love. So that was quite good.
That's brilliant. I wondered if we had any audience questions that we could move to.
But when I started, this was like 13 years ago, which was quite a while ago. I don't think publishing MAs were like that big back then. And also I don't think back then you needed even like a master's really to go into stuff. But then since I've been in it, like I've seen loads of people with master's degrees coming through, and I think it is more, I think when you're trying to go for jobs and get into publishing, I think the hiring people just want to see that you actually want to work at that publisher, that you don't have like a romantic view of publishing and you're like, I love books. Like if you ever have a job interview, please don't say that, because like obviously you work as a publisher, you should like books. But I think they just want to see someone who's interested in publishing as a business. That's really important. It is a business at the end of the day, and if you can kind of get that across to them, they'll be more interested in you, I think, and that you're aware of that kind of the savviness of the industry. But yeah, I just did English at uni. I think most people have done, but I think publishing masters is definitely beneficial. So I'm still learning. Like there's things I need to kind of work out. The job is kind of similar because you're kind of commissioning still, like an author. If you commission a book, you're sort of commissioning an author at the same time. I suppose there's more selling a book. So when you sign a book as an editor, I guess you have to pitch it internally. Whereas now I'm having to pitch it to like editors externally, I guess, and kind of trying to get them excited and meeting with them. That's quite a big part of the job that I wouldn't have done previously. And then negotiating is really important as well. So beforehand, I was only negotiating with authors who often maybe didn't know the industry so well, whereas now I'm working with editors who obviously have budgets and they don't want to give lots of money away or they don't want to give rights away. So you have to be quite like hard with them, and you don't know kind of what's going on in the background so much, and you don't want to push too much because you want to maintain a relationship with them. But then obviously you want to get the best deal for your author. So that's definitely the trickier side. And then, yeah, contracts and contract language, which is very specific and difficult to read sometimes, kind of working your way through that and learning. But there's like, I have help from people I know who work with contracts, and there's kind of an association I'm a part of and some other agents I know. So it's not, I've had kind of support around it as well.
You were talking earlier as well about the types of stories that publishers are taking on from queer writers, and that they're quite, or can be quite surface level, and that you're interested maybe in those stories that aren't being told. And how difficult is it to convey the need for those stories to publishers? Are they?
Um, it can be tricky because so yeah, publishers like comparable titles, but if none exist, you kind of have nothing to compare it to, so that
Mm,
makes it immediately difficult to kind of sell something. So you have to kind of try and convince them that there is a market for it. I mean, if the book is brilliantly written, that kind of really helps, right? It kind of deserves to be published because of that. But if it's written for a specific audience and the publisher doesn't feel like that audience is quite there, you kind of have to try and work out a way to show that it exists. Sometimes that can just be because the author has the right profile and it's tapped into those networks, or you have to do a bit of research around it to show them, like, yes, no, these people are there and they do exist and they do read books, and that's really important. But it can be, yeah, really difficult sometimes because there's no way to prove it with kind of quantities and numbers that from other books, and if
mm.
that was well. So you kind of have to sometimes find those books that have published and been successful. But sometimes they just, yeah, they're not quite there at the moment.
How, like, later on in the program, we've got people from Queer Lit coming to chat, and obviously even events like this at like libraries and things across the city and across the country. How important is the championing of these authors and these stories by by bookshops, by libraries, by readers as well, for the success?
Yeah, I think it's really important because it's almost like it's quite grassroots sort of
Yeah,
promotion in a way. And that can prove that there's a market and an interest. There's almost like, say, it's like a queer novel, right? And like the only market seems to be queer readers. If the queer community in the bookshops and the libraries are really promoting it and pushing it, that's like the first sort of kind of market kind of done. And then you want to kind of get out to that those secondary markets. And if there's a lot of hubbub and interest, it will start trickling out, as it were.
mm,
Obviously, there's been loads of queer books published that have done so well this year. Like we can't deny that. And I think sometimes, that it's because they've come from huge publishers with massive kind of publicity budgets, but others it's just because the book has gained a lot of interest from wherever the community or kind of bookshops are pushing it, and then it's kind of trickled out then beyond that. And I think that's really important, and that kind of grassroots level kind of help and support is like vital, I would say.
are there any kind of like favorite queer publishers that you have? Or yeah,
Um,
obviously Polari were going to join us on the
yeah,
panel, so that's
I love
what.
Pilar. Well, yeah. So I mean, I have to mention Cipher
Yeah,
Press because I think what they do is radical. They have very radical stories. I think they're really brilliant in what they do. They don't kind of shy away. I suppose if we're going to talk about taking risks, they are really taking risks.
yeah.
I would say a lot of what they've taken on maybe wouldn't have been published kind of elsewhere. So I think that's really important. Um, yeah, where I used to work, I think what they do in terms of non-fiction for children's and everything is really brilliant. Like they do a lot of kind of um, they're very intersectional, I suppose, in what they do, and they're really trying to reach a kind of broad audience. Which I think is really important. And then there's like dialogue books, which is part of Hachette. They've done a lot. I think actually one of the authors is here today. They've done so much for kind of change. Obviously, they've done a lot around for people of color, but the queer writing is really important. And they've just launched a new imprint, which is for the commercial side. That's really, I guess, there's in publishing, there's kind of literary publishing, and then there's commercial, which is like more like mass market. And I think queer lives and stories maybe aren't quite in that kind of Tesco bestseller yet, but I think maybe one day. But with imprints like Renegade, who's part of Dialogue Books, that could happen. Like they're giving the kind of weight behind these books and these stories. I think it's really important.
Well, yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.